With gatherings like this, I usually like to begin with a confession about a medical problem I have, and this medical problem might erupt into expression during the course of the next 35 minutes that I have with you. May I talk about the medical problem I have? Is that okay with you? Yeah. Don't worry, it's not a contagious disease. Yeah. So it's a strange affliction, and maybe you can help me with it. So let me share my affliction with you. When I see a cell phone, strange things happen to me. I don't know, I become mute, I become speechless, and then I have this great urge to get down and go be in front of the person using the cell phone and gaze at them with adoration. If you want me to do that, by all means use your cell phones. But on the other hand, my suggestion is let's sample signal and not noise for the next half an hour. So maybe park your phones. You don't need to sample them so repeatedly. So I have, of course, the pleasure of offering a course in the LEAD program called Friction Fixing and Leading Change. And you'll see why there's a connection between friction fixing and leading change. I'm just going to give you a high-level overview and share a few ideas from two books of ours. When I say ours, my wonderful co-author and comrade, Bob Sutton, who recently retired as a professor in the School of Engineering. Bob and I live in Menlo Park. We live a couple of streets away from each other. We love to drink nice wine, and we meet every week, and usually we think of new pretexts to drink wine. And I'm being honest, and one side effect of all the wine consumption is the books we write. So, the first book that I had the pleasure of writing with Bob was a book called Scaling Up Excellence. It was published in 2014. It was fun, it was the first book I'd ever written for a popular audience. Most of my writing was kind of very technical and quite honestly boring, And the book did well. It was a Wall Street Journal bestseller. Our new book is The Friction Project. It came out last year in January. There's no Wall Street Journal bestseller list, but the book's done well. It was chosen as one of the 2 best books by the Next Big Idea Club that's curated by Malcolm Gladwell, Adam Grant, that is, and a bunch of other people. And then the FT also chose it as one of the best business books of 2024. We're very grateful. Just because both of us wrote the book doesn't mean we really wrote it. Hundreds of people helped us with it. And my hope is the Friction Project particularly strikes a chord and makes you do something when you go back to work. So the subtitle of the Friction Project gives it all away. What's the job of smart leaders? Essentially, you have to make the right things easy to do, or easier to do. And then you got to make the wrong things harder to do. That's really the headline of this book. What is it we need to make easier to do in any company? My submission would be the 2 key things you want to make easier for people to do or engage in are to be curious and to be generous. Without curiosity, there's no innovation. Without generosity, there's no scale. So that's what you got to make easy. But in order to make things easy, you got to take out bad friction, obstacles that exhaust people. I'll say more about that in a minute. Conversely, on the other side, our job as leaders is to prevent overconfidence and myopia. Very easy for decision makers to be overconfident and myopic. So you need to stick in obstacles that slow down people to cause reflection and deliberation. Otherwise, the thing executives love the most is pulling the trigger on a decision and feeling great about it, even though they may not understand all of the consequences of the decision they've made. So let's actually begin by understanding what is excellence. When I normally ask people what is excellence, the sorts of things they tell me are best in class, high NPS, great place to work, all of the above. They're all great, but Bob and I feel they're the outcomes of excellence. For us, an excellent organization is one where people do the right thing even when nobody's policing them. That's what a great company is. You can't hire 5 people and hire a cop to police them. Soon you'll be overrun with cops, and you can imagine what the consequences are of a firm overrun with cops. Why and when do people do the right thing even when nobody's policing them? 40 years of research suggests that the answer hinges on felt accountability. Now, I've underscored the word felt because it's not a bunch of KPIs. Anybody can give each other KPIs. What's the big deal, I was actually with one company there the other day. I said, how many KPIs do you have? And they said, we have 125. I nearly fainted. Can you imagine? I mean, so the real thing is it depends on a feeling of ownership, like I psychologically own the place, and at the same time, the feeling that the place owns me. So let me give you a simple experiment to underscore this. I'd ask my graduate student to take 82 startup teams. They're all tech startups, 4 persons each. Assign them randomly to control 41 teams in treatment condition, 41 teams. We told all 82 teams, your job is to design a new product, and we'll get experts to evaluate you. But then to the 41 teams in the treatment condition, I went to them and said, hey, before you begin designing your new product, why don't you spend a little while thinking about your key strength, and most of all, a job title that telegraphs it to the others in the team. And you can choose any title you want. And these are tech startups. They chose titles like Guru of Cybersecurity, Defender of the Source Code, a little extreme. Chief mischief maker, instigator. Who do you think did better? Teams where people chose their own job titles or teams where people didn't? Yeah, teams where people chose the job titles did better. Obviously, if I choose the title, I own it. But hey, if I say I'm the guru of cybersecurity, I ought to live up to it, and there comes obligation. So you can see how likely obligation as well as ownership are being activated. Now the problem is it's very, very hard very hard to scale felt accountability. One reason is anonymity. The larger a firm, the easier it is for people to be invisible. There's so many of you. The canonical experiment I would do is randomly assign you to 2 groups. Everybody to my left is given dark sunglasses. Everybody to my right is given clear glasses like the ones I'm wearing. They're given an identical task and the same opportunity to cheat. Who do you think is going to cheat more? Dark sunglasses or clear glasses? Yeah, 4 times more likely. How did I give them dark sunglasses? Randomly. Which means you and I, if we get a pair of dark sunglasses, we give ourselves the green light to do bad things. So the problem with anonymity is it's not bad people doing bad things, it's good people doing bad things. That's the problem. Now, the experiment about the job title is a way to undercut felt anonymity. But really, Bob and I wrote the book because of the observations that people made. As we were sharing ideas from scaling up excellence, the top and senior echelons of an enterprise, they really loved the message of the book. But as you went lower down, people kept saying, it's really hard to get anything done. And we really wanted to understand it, and people gave us gifts. There were 2 people who gave us gifts that were like blows to our solar plexuses. And the book is our small effort to sort of speak to their anguish and sort of do something about it. I was once teaching in a Stanford executive program, and we have tiered classrooms and we have name tags, and this young guy didn't have a name tag in the name. I went to him and I said, hey, what's your name? And he told me his name. And I said, where do you work? And he looked at me with a glint of mischief in his eyes and said, Professor Rao, I actually work in a frustration factory. I was like stumped. Nobody had ever said anything to me like that. And I said, what happens at work? And it was a litany of frustration. I mean, peaking throughout the day. At 5 o'clock, the guy is exhausted. And then I can never forget this young woman who was actually in one of our programs. She said this with a tear in her eye and a quiver in her voice. And what she said is, when I go home, I only have the scraps of myself for my family. That is tragic. It's wrong. And what is the model American company's response to this? Immediately categorize it as, and American companies have a great tendency to psychologize everything. So, what's your name, young man? Ming Lu. So if Ming Lu had said this, his company, if it was American, would have said, oh my God, Ming Lu has a work-life balance issue. Let's give him a meditation app. Is that going to do much for you, Ming Lu? That's the kind of bullshit I'm talking about. Because it's very easy for firms to give individuals SOPs and meticulously chronicle how many people downloaded it and like bullshit statistics like that. The real problem is not meditation. The real problem is the terrible way in which we design work in organizations. And that's really what the course is about on friction fixing and leading change. Now, time poverty is the other side of the coin called speed. I won't kind of bore you with a lot of details, but experimentally when you manipulate time constraints to people, give them shorter and shorter amounts of time, it's fascinating how many corners people cut in order to achieve the objective. Not only do they cut the corner, but when their performance is really terrible, they devote disproportionate amount of time to looking good in front of the boss. That's the consequence of time poverty. So it sounds great to talk about speed. I don't know what time I have. We have somebody here who's supposed to tell me how much time I have, but I could go after study after study. The important thing about time poverty is, in one study we showed, the quicker you became a unicorn as a startup and got a $1 billion valuation, the probability of lawsuits from regulators and customers went up. Naturally. You want to get a $1 billion valuation, what are you going to do? You're going to cut corners and you want to scale and you want to do this. And that's when regulators and customers get your attention. Now the sad thing is, it's just one thing if the problem was only one of time poverty, but we have another problem, and the other problem is the addition bias. In our book, The Friction Project, we talk about the fact that this particular bias hasn't received much scholarly attention, but it's endemic. In the picture is our friend Leidy Klotz. Leidy is a professor in the University of Virginia. He wrote a paper with 20 experiments. It didn't matter what you asked people to do. They just added. Hey, let's build a Lego model. Do we do it with 4 parts? People say, no, let's do it with 15. You can imagine how complicated that is. Or plan a vacation. You add more destinations, you need to recover from the vacation. And in the last task, which was to reform a university, 11% of the suggestions had to do with subtraction, 89 had to do with addition. What do you think is the consequence of relentless addition? Doesn't relentless addition happen in all of your companies? Because what makes a boss feel happy? To add shit to your plate. Right? And then they call it Operation Panther. And you're thinking, like, wait a minute, what is that about? It's funny, every time I go to companies, and the greater the likelihood that a change initiative is named after a sleek animal, the lower the probability of success. I mean, Operation Gazelle, and you're rolling your eyes, and they can't put one foot in front of another. So, again, given the shortage of time, the consequence of the addition bias colloquially is we say, oh my God, the person burnt out. Of course, the person's fatigued. But the more insidious, the more pernicious consequence is willpower is eroded. When you increase mental load on people, our willpower shrinks. And when our willpower shrinks, can you choose to be curious and generous? See, curiosity and generosity, they're not just individual dispositions, they're choices. You got to make a choice to be curious, right? You got to make a choice to be generous. If you don't, end of story. And what relentless addition does is it just lowers everything. The experiment I loved the most was done at Yale Divinity School. They taught 100 people the parable of the Good Samaritan. You got to help people when they're in distress. So 100 people were taught this. They were randomly put into two groups. The group to my right was given half an hour to think of a speech on the parable of the Good Samaritan, rehearse it, and walk over from here to the Schwab building. The group to my left was only given 5 minutes. You can imagine the addition bias interacting with time poverty. 5 minutes to think of the speech, rehearse it, walk over to Schwab. Unbeknownst to this group, the experimenters had hired Yale University undergraduates to lie on the path from the Memorial Auditorium to the church, to Schwab, and these people had red paint and ketchup oozing from them. And they were groaning and moaning, saying, "I'm dying, I need help," and so on. And they wanted to find out how many of the people who just listened to a 1-hour talk and were given 5 minutes to think of the speech, rehearse it, and go to Schwab would actually stop and help these people. What do you think? 88% of the people just walked right by them. You're thinking, I got to give a speech on helping other people. I'm rehearsing it. I'm in pain. I need help. Tough shit, buddy. I got to give a speech. Like in 5 minutes, the urge to help was extinguished. 5 minutes. Can you imagine what happens in companies? So what should we do? The answer is, we should reverse addition sickness. This is my good friend Michael Deering, and he put it beautifully. Leaders, all of you, ought to be like editors-in-chief of a newspaper or a magazine. What does the editor of a newspaper or a magazine do? They take out the things that bore, bewilder, frustrate, and exhaust people. Or all of you being editors-in-chief? I'll take that as a no. I'm sure your bosses aren't editors-in-chief either. Am I making sense here? Can I be really, am I being taped here? Shit. But anyway, I feel brave enough to say this. I was with this company, and because if you're going to be an editor-in-chief, you're actually thinking of yourself as a trustee of the employee's time. Because the best bosses don't waste the time of their employees. The best bosses don't actually send them on wild goose chases. The worst bosses are time thieves. I was at this one company and I asked these executives, "Any time thieves in your company?" And one young guy looked at me and said, "Professor, we have an edgier name for bosses who steal our time." I said, "What is it?" He said, "It's close to a bad word." I said, "Out with it." And he looks at me and says, "Professor, in our company, we call bosses who waste our time clock suckers." Yeah, you got to be very careful when you say that. I know all of you are thinking, clock sucker, clock sucker. Isn't that a lovely name? I thought so, you know. Somebody suggested I sell T-shirts called Clock Sucker. So, you know, I don't know about that, but... so what should you do? You really ought to help reverse addition sickness. I'm going to give a couple of quick examples. This is like a simple example. Melinda Ashton, a physician in Hawaii, she got fed up with the electronic patient record system and said it was plain stupid, and what she wanted to do was to get rid of it. She launched a campaign called "Let's Get Rid of Stupid Stuff." She got 188 suggestions. Just because a person suggests that we should subtract it, you can't, because somebody else upstream or downstream might benefit it. You got to think of what the spillover consequences are. They curated the list to 87, and you can actually see I'm giving you the most trivial change they made. What was that? They reduced a mouse click that took 24 seconds, but during patient rounds, when they totaled it all up, they were astonished to find that it was actually 1,700 nursing hours a month. One mouse click. Now, one mouse click might not be a lot. Bob and I wrote a case study about AstraZeneca, which of course is a pharma company. It's regulated. You can't subtract anything. That's Pushkala Subramaniam. And she and her team saved AstraZeneca 2 million hours. To do what? Not to save the wages of 1148 FTEs, but to give 2 million hours back to the company as a gift of time. To do what? To serve 4 million more customers, run 400 early phase trials, and so on. To do more work. Why did they save time? To improve capacity. And this is one of the things we talk about in the course. You should always lead change, if you can, with a gift of time. Because when you give people the gift of time, they listen to you. They'll also reciprocate. And the reason many transformation initiatives fail is there isn't really any gift of time. People just keep adding. And the reason people keep adding is the higher up you go, people with power, they have tunnel vision. They don't search. People up at the apex of an enterprise, one study shows they underestimate coordination difficulty by 50% or more. So things look easy for them. And so, add. So that's the problem. Now, how did Pushkala save 2 million hours? It's not like, she said, we got 20,000 employees, let's kind of divide 2 million by 20,000. That's kind of unimaginative. They actually went and they went to R&D and said, hey, you guys discover, design, and develop and deliver. Let's look at all of these phases and give you 100,000 hours more. They looked at the mistakes the company was repeating again and again, and they saved time in China, India, so on. I was recently working with the executive vice presidents of a large Middle Eastern company. And when you kind of teach them, you don't like give them a case study because they're not going to read it. You just have a conversation with them. And I said, hey, what do you guys do at work every week? So one EVP told me, Professor, we prepare weekly highlights. I said, what are those? He said, achievements every week. But I said, shouldn't the achievements be autocorrelated? Like achievements at T0 predict achievements at T1, right? I mean, like what is so hard about it? He said, that's the problem. We have to be creative. So I'm thinking, God, they're making shit up. And I said, who does these highlights? Every level in the company. And I said, what do you do after preparing these highlights? And he looks at me and says, we have meetings to discuss them. I just said, wait a minute. You ginned up a fairy tale and then you have meetings to discuss fairy tales? He said, exactly. When I put them through some basic exercises, they were astonished to find they could save 25 million hours. So the problem is, it's not that organizations don't subtract, they lay off people, and then they reallocate bullshit work amongst other people, like preparing weekly highlights and things. So the real problem is subtraction in any company is like mowing the lawn. It's not one and done. How often do we have to mow the lawn? I would assume pretty regularly. Because if you don't mow the lawn, what's going to happen? The weeds are going to overrun the place and you can't plant a new sapling. Is anybody mowing the lawn in your companies? And that's the problem. Mowing the lawn is an orphan problem. But you know what? Great leaders like yourselves, your job is to actually solve orphan problems. That's what I look at when I evaluate a leader. What problem did you solve that people were bitching about and nobody did anything about it? What did you do? That is what great leaders are. Not people who kind of give you results when they're told to give you results. A lot of people can do that. It's not a big deal, at least to me. So, very, very, very important to mow the lawn. Now, lest you think the task is only to remove bad friction, the things that bore, bewilder, frustrate, and exhaust people, that would be incomplete. Bad friction is like bad cholesterol. But you also need good cholesterol. And that's good friction. Good friction consists of obstacles that actually slow down decision making, that actually make people pause, think, consider more alternatives and the like. So in a sense, what it is you're trying to lower overconfidence all the time. You're trying to lower myopia all the time. So I won't bore you with a lot of these slides other than I should actually give you a lovely example of friction. The guy in blue right at my back on the left is actually Todd Park. Todd's got a company called Devoted Health. Todd and his brother Ed, Todd used to be the chief technology officer in the Obama White House. He's like a remarkable entrepreneur. So he and his brother created this company after Devoted Health, after selling Athena, their prior startup, for $17 billion. I had Todd in my class that I teach for MBAs here, and I said, hey Todd, why are you doing this Devoted Health thing? And he said, American healthcare is terrible, we need to do something about it. Devoted Health is fully vertically integrated. They have their own insurance plan, their own doctors, 70 to 100 employees. They look after patients 65 and above in order to make sure they're healthy, lest we incur huge expenditures later in their life. According to Andreessen Horowitz, they might soon become one of the largest companies in America. When Todd came to my class, I asked him, Todd, what's your biggest contribution to Devoted Health? And he said, the Prime Directive. I said, what, you channeling Isaac Asimov? Isaac Asimov was the guy who came up with the Prime Directive. So I said, what is it? Look at how he's introducing friction, good friction in Devoted Health. What's the thing? What's the Prime Directive? All 70 to 100 people, irrespective of level, location, etc., function. The Prime Directive is, before you make a decision about a patient, ask yourself, what would you do if the patient, what would I do if the patient was my mother or father? What's he doing? He's slowing people down. He's not saying put a smile on the customer's face and give the product away free. He's saying slow down, think. Don't do things automatically, myopically. What do they do in most healthcare things? You go for something, they'll deny. Deny, deny. It's the easiest thing in the world to do. He went with this to Howard Schultz and asked Howard Schultz, what do you think? And Howard Schultz of Starbucks said, I love this. And Todd was kind of surprised and he said, why? And Howard Schultz said, you don't need to train anybody. Think about it. Do you need to train people in this? And that's what introducing good friction is all about. What I love about it is even a 10-year-old can understand it. And you've got to come up with things that 10-year-olds can understand, but this is an example of good friction. There are many, many examples of adding good friction. We have a huge thing called friction forensics. I won't have the time to go through all of this. I'm just going to kind of give you a couple more examples to drive home the point. So if you go to Andreessen Horowitz, the venture capital company, and observe their investment management committee, they look at lots of pitches and probably invest in 14, 15 companies. But the norm is if all 5 people on the committee agree that a startup is a great idea to invest money in, they'll never put money in that startup. Why is that? 5 people have agreed. Why don't they put money in the startup? Tell me, come on. Yeah, maybe you didn't do the due diligence. Maybe you didn't know somebody who was actually doing this or has already done this. Plus, we're investing in disruptive startups. Surely they ought to be controversial. So disagreement is a sign of due diligence in a sense. Am I making sense with all of you? So in the state of Massachusetts, Blue Cross had a problem. Physicians were writing opioid prescriptions. How do you prevent that? You can't tell them you can't prescribe opioids. We don't have the power to do that. What Blue Cross realized was the best way to do that was to impose a 10-minute tax on them. Every time you prescribe opioids, write a one-page memo. It took 10 minutes on average to write the memo. Just creating that little 10-minute tax lowered opioid prescriptions by around 20 million tablets in the state of Massachusetts. It's amazing. So the thing is, that's really our job. You have to take bad friction to really make it easy for people to be curious and generous, and you got to put in good friction to prevent overconfidence and myopia. Because if you don't do that, what are companies going to do? Most companies suffer from an excess of bad friction. So the right things become very hard to do. They have a lack of good friction. And so the wrong things become very easy to do. Is that the kind of company that we want to be in? I hope not. My hope is you as leaders do something about it. Thank you very much for your time and attention. Thank you. You're very kind. You're very kind.